Hello bloggers, good morning, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Yesterday I had done with my speakership regarding the topic of cultural sensitivity towards indigenous peoples or indigenous students here in the Philippines. Um, it was worth it, it was a good experience. Um, I just want to relay or re-echo what I have done yesterday evening. Um, Education has long been considered a critical factor to closing the gap in indigenous disadvantage. Now, who are these indigenous students? These are the students who came from far-flung areas or from the remote areas, especially here in the Philippines. Now, these students are actually belonging to a tribes or people in the mountains. Some are also belonging to a tribes. Now, take note of the word a critical factor to closing the gap. Now, education, according to Nelson Mandela, is a powerful tool to change the world. And many of our brothers and sisters who are still living in the far-flung areas, in the remote areas, are actually uh, disadvantaged when it comes to education. There are two objectives that I'm going to present this morning. Number one objective is to examine the factors that can contribute to an indigenous student's success in the learning environment. And number two objectives is that it is also important to identify the key principles of effective schools and the programs and initiatives that have been implemented in schools to effectively engage and improve the learning standards through improved school experiences of all indigenous students. Now, these are the two objectives that I'm going to emphasize and tackle this morning. To understand the perceived inability to change schooling as it exists today, there are varied reasons whether or not there is a positive or negative impact of the teachers to indigenous students. Number one factor is that the role of a teacher. Do the teachers have an impact positively or negatively towards the indigenous students? Another alternative point of view of indigenous students are the community. Now, what are the rules of the community in order to protect the welfare of the indigenous students? Do the indigenous students are performing well while in the classroom? That's a question. The questions on how indigenous students are performing at school in urban and remote locations and discusses attendance and engagement measures as outcomes of improved learning environments. There are at least differences between the students from the urban areas and the students from the remote areas. As a teacher, I will be able to identify who are my IP students or indigenous students. They can easily identify by their accent, by the dress they are wearing. So for me, it's not difficult for me to identify because the very moment I enter the classroom, I will be able to identify who are my IB students. Furthermore, many indigenous parents might be more reliant on schools to facilitate educational outcomes for their children than non-indigenous parents because they may feel alienated from the educational system and and because most of the parents of indigenous students felt alienated from the education system because they might be thinking that they lack the skills and knowledge to effectively support their children throughout the school year. Indigenous parents may feel alienated because of their own negative experiences with or exclusion from school rather. Now, the question again is how are indigenous students performing at school? Indigenous young people are the most disadvantaged group, especially here in the Philippines. Social disadvantage can act as a barrier to learning, of course, because of their living circumstance. It's not easy for them to attend their school days. Why? Because there are so many factors. Number one is poverty. Number two is transportation, and a lot more circumstances they actually encountered by by the time they are journeying their studies. Mm. It has been noted that completion rates and national test scores for literacy and numeracy are being indicators of educational outcomes, especially here in the Philippines. And completion rates, many of the indigenous students are actually leaving the school early due to different circumstances. One thing leads to another is it is more difficult and more costly to access education in remote areas, and the educational institutions that are available are often lacking in basic services, adequately trained teachers, or students' amenities that can contribute to the gradual disengagement and early school leaving of the indigenous students. For example, many indigenous children live in a combination of conditions that can have adverse effects on their capacity to effectively participate in school and classroom activities. For example, if you are teaching mathematics and you are doing quadratic equation, and most of the IP students, indigenous students, were not able to attend during your discussion, of course, they will be left behind. They were absent that day, so they cannot perform quadratic equations. Such condition can include poverty, poor or unsafe community environment, limited access to mainstream services, and poor health condition. Now, it is always important for schools to be aware of the background of their students and how that affects the capacity of the indigenous students to learn. In this way, schools will be able to create a learning environment that recognizes and addresses the distinctive needs of indigenous students. Voice teaching, student voices, student diversity. That's all. Those are all the problems. Those are those are all the factors, contributing factors that the school should focus. One thing leads to another. One thing more is that we have to identify the culture of these indigenous students. Otherwise, it will be misleading. And as a teacher, we are not bringing the students to uplift their development to acquire more knowledge and skills. We can be a negative impact sometimes. So it's always we have to be under we have to be aware that these indigenous students shall be given a treatment, fair treatment. We have to know their culture because they felt neglected, they felt insecure, and they felt that education is only for highly civilized people. However, nowadays in the Philippines, the government has been supporting the IP students. They are working out to at least give more importance to the IP students. They they actually formulate such policies in order to protect the welfare and the rights of the underprivileged of the indigenous students. So hopefully, maybe after the years progress, I hope the government should formulate a policy that would really identify the problems of IP students. So thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much for viewing. As I told you in my blog, that my blog site can also feature different different genre of language, informations, and etc. That's all for today, and don't forget to click subscribe and share. Thank you.